Hey everyone, this is Jonathan Spigler with J2R Solutions. This is the first of these videos that we're going to do, and it's just going to give you a cool kind of solution brief integrating some of our partners' technologies. So today we're going to actually look at setting up Splunk in a SAML configuration and leveraging F5 as the SAML identity provider. So first and foremost, if you are not familiar with what SAML is, SAML stands for Security Associative Markup Language. And the purpose of SAML is really to leverage, you could say, modern web-based authentication methods. These are especially good whenever you have resources and authentication providers and identity providers that aren't within the same enterprise, or whenever you have maybe multiple organizations or corporations trying to leverage a single digital asset or service or application, and you want to have the identities reside at the location of the corporation that maybe you're partnering with, and you don't want to manage those identities. And it gives just a lot of opportunity for scale and other even like service to service interoperability. So Splunk has adopted that as an authentication method, which is great. It opens up a lot of opportunities for you to um, kind of scale Splunk out and kind of use a modern auth standard or modern web auth standard. Um, and now pivoting to F5, why would we want to use F5 as the SAML identity provider? And again, I'm not going to go extensively into what SAML is. I think you can do some research and look it up and get some background on what SAML does. Just kind of high level, real quick. It is all web based, right? Nothing is happening server to server. It's all done client browser based, unless you're doing like artifact resolution, which we're not doing in this case, nor the SAML support. Um, but pivoting over to why would we want to leverage F5 as our SAML identity provider? Well, for one thing, and this is just kind of, this goes for a lot of applications, the innate limitation of Splunk is that it's a one-to-one mapping from identity provider to service provider. So Splunk being the service provider in this case, right? The one that is consuming the SAML assertion from the identity provider. It can only do a single mapping to a single identity provider. So that, therein lies kind of one problem. If you have multiple users spread across different organizations that have different identity providers, you either have to stand up multiple search heads, which can be expensive from an administrative O&M and resource consumption cost. But also, or you either have to do that or you have to find an alternative solution, and F5 can be that solution. Frankly, it can be a single identity provider to Splunk, but then actually federate with multiple identity providers on the quote unquote front end of the big IP. Leveraging those tokens then to ultimately then translate those attributes so that Splunk can consume it. So it can kind of be that broker or kind of that hub for multiple SAML identity providers. There's other features and capabilities of F5 APM also, such as single sign-on, leveraging multi-factor authentication. So whatever authentication flow you have up front, you can leverage that and then kind of translate those values and those tokens to a consuming application like Splunk downstream. And obviously, F5 is much more scalable than your standard kind of like either open source or whatever solution out there. So this particular solution is kind of geared towards probably more enterprise because obviously F5 comes with the cost, but the features and the capabilities are quite rich. And this just kind of, exhibits that capability. So the way we're going to kind of set this up, we're going to start with setting up our local identity provider within or on our big IP. We're going to set up, this is assuming we already have an access profile set up. So we're not going to go through that. Again, we're not trying to cover that extensively. This is going to be focused on just the SAML portion. We're going to set up the identity provider. We're then going to export that metadata. We're going to import it into Splunk. I'm going to kind of highlight some of the gotchas that I ran into whenever I was setting this up. And then we're going to export the metadata from our service provider, Splunk, and import that as an external service provider connector within Big IP APM. We're going to connect these two. We're going to bind them. We're going to create a SAML resource, and finally, we're going to test it, and hopefully, it works. So along the way, I'm going to kind of explain. Now, this is just a single deployment. There's a variety of different deployment methods out there. Some specific callouts to specific SAML solutions, such as Okta, The documentation for that is right here. You can do a quick Google search, and there's a bunch of examples of doing it with ADFS, with Okta, ping identity, etc. F5 is not covered, so hopefully this video is a good supplementary kind of documentation and resource to do this. So let's get started. So let's pivot over to our big IP. So I already have my access profile set up. We're going to start with, I already have my virtual server set up, so all that's been kind of pre-staged for us, right? We're going to actually go into federation, and we're going to go to identity provider, and we're going to create a brand new identity provider service, right? So we're going to create. Sorry about that. Just had to verify I had something set up and ready to go. All right, so we're going to click on create under services, and we're going to call this, and this is just the name of, Jim's going to kind of follow it. You can name this just a friendly name that's going like the resource in big IP. So I'm just going to call it idp.aws.jet2solutions.com. All right, and there's a couple different ways you can name. This is where stuff actually does matter. This is what's actually going to be placed in the SAML assertion whenever a SAML is brought back to the service provider. I typically use the URL. You can use the URN if you want, and then of the identity provider. Now, this particular FQDN is the actual virtual server, the DNS resolution for the virtual server. Now, you're going to see that we have a web top set up. That's not necessarily not completely necessary. You can do a, yes, you could say a headless IDP, or you can have it kind of centralized to a web top, but we'll get into that here in a little bit. And then we're going to place the FQDN in our host name here. So let's move down the options. We're not going to do anything with ECP. It's all going to be browser-based for single sign-on. We're not going to do any artifact resolution. And the next one, email assertion subject. We're going to pick email. Great point that I want to pause real quick. So there's a couple of requirements that Splunk is looking for when it comes to a SAML configuration. The SAML that must be included in the SAML assertion include role, real name, and mail. Now, there's ways that you could, if you don't have any control over what attribute names are coming from your upstream IDP, there is ways you can create aliases in Splunk to say, hey, instead of role, if I see groups or permissions or something like that, that's the you want to focus on from a SAML perspective. But if you just do default, this is what Splunk is anticipating and needs in order to function whenever you're setting up SAML as the authentication method, right? So pivoting back, we're going to, for our email address, we are going to use, sorry, I'm going to have to pause the video just so I can get my variable. Now, you can kind of put whatever you want in here for the actual assertion subject value. So this is actually going to be a session variable from your APM session. If you're not familiar with APM session variables, again, this is something that you probably need to research and better understand to leverage these session variables, because this is ultimately what makes up the SAML assertion. But we're going to be using a custom session variable that I actually extract from my client certificate. Again, this could be anything that you kind of want it to be. If it's going to be derived from like Active Directory, if you're querying Active Directory or some LDAP server or something else, maybe you're pulling it from another SAML token, you're going to take that APM session variable and you're going to place this in the assertion subject value, right? Everything else can stay as is. We're going to go down to SAML attributes. This is where we need to specify those particular SAML attributes. We're going to start with role. We don't need to do anything for name format. We're going to go add. And then for mine, again, this is not going to be identical to yours. You're going to need to map it to whatever APM session variables are relevant for your environment. For mine, I'm literally for this proof of concept, I'm using a local database to pull this group from, and it maps to what you're going to see later, the actual Splunk role within my Splunk environment. So that's the only value I need for that. We're going to hit OK. We're going to then create one for, make sure I do everything right, role. I already did role. Real name. Now, real name is going to be the uniquely identifiable name within the Splunk environment. And this could be really anything. For me, it's just going to be my name. But if you are in an environment where you have a unique ID, or you have maybe a concatenation of the first, middle, and last name, along with maybe some other type of annotation of what their role is, that's where you could place it. So it has make it a uniquely identifiable name, right? And that's ultimately what will be displayed whenever you log into Splunk. So real name, and what I'm going to use for my real name is simply my session last logon name. There we go. We're going to hit OK. And then we're going to do the last one, which is male. All right. And for that one, again, it's just going to be I'm going to use the same session variable that I actually did in my entity ID or my previous step. Okay. So that is good to go. So let's move on to the security settings. So we need a signing key. So whenever we specify the signing key, this is what will be actually leveraged by the service provider to verify that this is in fact a trusted identity provider, right? So this is actually a pretty important step, because make sure you have whatever cert that you select, make sure that you have it in PEM format, along with the entire chain. Certificate authority, because that's going to need to be copy and pasted into your Splunk configuration. Now, I kind of using the default F5. Now, for enterprise environments, for production environments, I don't suggest doing this. Obviously, use a organizationally or a certificate that is issued by your organization, right? That is trusted. And this is definitely true for federal customers, that certificate security and compliance is super critical, right? So that is that. We're going to hit OK. And now we have our configuration. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to export metadata, right? Don't worry about signing the metadata. We don't need to do that. And I don't even think we can actually do that when imported into Splunk. And we're just going to drop that right into downloads. No big deal, right? As you can see, I've gone through this a couple different times. Let's pivot over to Splunk. All right, so the configuration, if you're at the home page, just click password authentication methods. And we're going to click SAML and configure Splunk to use SAML, right? All right, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to select the metadata downloaded. So we're going to do the one that that was last night. We're going to do this one. And there we go, right timestamp. Okay, cool. And you'll see that it populates everything down here. So that's great. Now, this is one of the things that, I want to kind of emphasize and point out some of the gotchas that I ran into whenever I first set this up. It seems like everything is all set up, but if you read the documentation carefully, you need to include something IDP certificate chains, even if it's a single, even if like in our case that we're using just a default certificate, there's no chain, you need to copy and paste the actual PEM value in here. So an easy place to get this, if you're just trying to test this out and get it to work, if you go to your big IP, you go underneath certificate management, traffic certificate management, SSL certificates, and we go to that default cert right here. You can either export it, download the .crt, or you literally just copy and paste it from right here. So we're going to Control-C that, and we're going to pivot back over to Splunk, and we're going to paste that right into there, all right, and remove that extra line, all right? And then you have other options here. If you're in a search head cluster, this replicates the actual certificate against search head clusters. Now, I'm not sure why you wouldn't want to do that, but maybe there is some reasons. You have your issuer identity. So this is super critical that this aligns to whatever you have configured in your F5, because F5 is anticipating to see this value when you do your redirect from Splunk, because by the way, familiar with SAML, and you're familiar with SP initiated or IDP initiated SAML flows. In the concepts of those. This is an SP initiated flow. So when you go to Splunk, it will actually redirect you back to your identity provider. It's the identity provider it's configured to reference. This is critical to have this in here, because this value is going to be in your authentication, your auth request, right? Your auth request. Signed auth request, we're going to leave that selected. And then for entity ID, so we're going to put a unique identifier in here. This is what identifies the Splunk SAML SP within your F5 configuration. So for this, I'm just going to use the actual F2DM for this. I'm going to do splunk.carby.aws.g2rsolutions.com. So then we have some other options in here, and these, unfortunately, we can't take advantage of AQRs. This is just not something, to my knowledge, is available with F5. I'll do a little more research, and if anybody has any other knowledge that's that points to the otherwise, please comment below and say, hey, this is how you can actually use AQRs with F5. Authentication extensions, I haven't messed around with this. So again, if you have any insight to that, please share. Here's those role aliases or the SAML attribute aliases. So again, if you don't have really any control of what variables, or sorry, what SAML attributes are coming from your upstream IDP, this is where you can actually mention an alias. So instead of maybe role in your SAML attribute in its member of or permissions or whatever, this is where you would specify that to align to what your SAML identity provider is issuing to you, right? So name ID format, we're using email address and kind of align that. I don't even think really you have to specify this. You can leave it blank. I've done it both ways and it seems to work, but I'm just going to kind of keep it in line with my big IP configuration. Fully qualified domain name or IP of the load balancer. So this is super important. Make sure that by default, Splunk is going to redirect you back to, if you don't fill this in, it's going to redirect you back to whatever the host name is in its server configuration along with its port, right? So typically in an enterprise environment, you're going to have this behind a load balancer. This is, in my case, this is actually what we have going on, right? I do not want to be redirected to port 8000 on HTTP. I want to be redirected to my FQDN on port 443 over HTTPS. So I need to make that abundantly clear, and this is how we do this. So we say, hey, my fully qualified domain name is Splunk. Splunk.carbide.aws.g2rsolutions.com. All right, in the redirect, we're going to say 443. We're also going to select HTTP post and HTTP post and save. Now, once we save that, we're going to go back into our SAML configuration, click on that button again, and we're going to review all this. Splunk, we're good there, we're good there. Now, first thing you need to fix is this. So it's going to do HTTP. Even though we specified 443 down here, it's going to default to HTTP. So put an S in there, HPS, if you're going across this. So I'm homing URL because that's one of the security SAMLs to make sure that is encrypted. So put an S there, save that again. Let's go back into it. Now we're going to download the XML file. All right. So remember number 4 for that. All right. So you're going to download that. Keep that handy because we're going to use this in our next steps. All right. Save this. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to map a group. Now you're going to probably have a much more extensive mapping than this. And again, where we have more than one group that maps to multiple roles. So please comment in comment section if you've mapping multiples, and if there's a particular format that you need to do this in whenever you're parsing out your SAML assertion for roles. But what we're going to do, the group name we're going to align to, and this is the name that's going to correspond to the value in our SAML assertion. So our SAML assertion is going to come in within the role attribute. We're going to have the value Splunk admins in this test, right? Splunk, if Splunk sees Splunk admins, it should map that group name to the role of admin. Pretty straightforward, right? Now, I would be curious to see, and I probably wouldn't be too hard to test, if we have multiple group names, what that does, and if you can map multiple roles. I would imagine that's the case, but I need to test it out. But for this, we're just going to kind of set up the piping of this, and then we can test that later, all right? So let's save that. We have our role mapping, so that's great. Now we have our ID, we have our service provider configured. There's a couple other tweaks and modification you're going to see, but we're probably about 60% of the way there. All right, so we're going to pivot back over to our big IP. We're going to go into Federation. Underneath Identity Provider, we're going to do External SP Connectors. Underneath External SP Connectors, over here on Create, click on the little arrow, and you want to import from metadata. We're going to select the file, and we're going to do the SP metadata that we just exported. So we're going to click on that. And then we're going to give the service provider name. Again, this is a friendly name that's going to relate to the object that's created on the big IP, right? It has no influence or effect on the actual SAML assertion itself or the SAML configuration itself. It is just something that you can recognize that, oh, this is associated to this configuration, right? So we're just going to call this Splunk. No big deal. And we're going to hit OK. All right. Now that we have that set up, not everything is 100% correct in this, at least every time I've set it up, I've had to go and modify it. So whenever you import metadata, it's supposed to really help take off the burden and the workload of trying to hand roll and manually do all this. And there's other situations where you literally can have your SP or your SP configuration on your IDP updated automatically by referencing a publicly available SP metadata URL in URI. That's not the case for this. We're going to have to go in and actually modify some of the imported configurations, and you're going to see where. So first thing, we're good here. Service provider entity, that all lines up. We're good to go there. Let's drop down to endpoint configuration. This actually looks like we're correct, and I think it's because we made that modification in there. So I think we should be good on that. Oh, wonderful. All right, so we don't need to do anything on that. Security stuff. So required sign authentication, this lines up to what Splunk is expecting, and assertions must be signed. So everything looks good there. This SAML cert, this actually is derived from, you can actually go into op, I'm assuming you install Splunk and op Splunk. You know, the op Splunk etc auth, and I believe it's an IDP certs, or it might actually be server cert. I have to look. But this is a cert that's derived, a public cert that's derived from the Splunk server, and that PEM value gets included, or that base64 value gets included in the metadata, and then F5 imports it whenever you import that metadata. So it just makes the process a lot easier. Okay, this looks like it's actually all set up correctly too, so that's great. So in my previous configurations, I've actually had to update the HTTP and HTTPS values, and that kind of threw me for a loop. Okay, so everything looks good there. Now, the next thing, again, if you've stepped through any type of SAML configuration in F5, this is where people kind of get lost. They haven't gotten lost already. We want to bind together this identity provider along with the service provider. So we go here, click, we're going to click bind, and we're going to click Splunk. And assuming everything is correct, it should bind. Now, if there is an issue, it will actually throw up a red X and say it's not able to bind because X reason, whether because is expecting the assertion to be signed and you don't have that set up on your IDP configuration or whatever it may be. So we're good to go there. Now, we still cannot access this resource, meaning we can't access the identity provider resource. But this is not accessible either via web top, or if it's not accessible even without a web top. So we need to make it accessible. So this is kind of the last link in the chain. We've created all these kind of dependent objects, prerequisite objects to this final point, which is creating a SAML resource. So we're going to click on SAML resources here at the top, or you can go down here, SAML resource. You click on create, and we're going to call this IDP 1, right? We're not going to publish this on the web top right now. You can if you want, but I really don't see, I see that more in IDP initiated flows. So for this, we're not going to publish this on the web top, but if you have an IDP initiated flow, you absolutely would publish that on a web top. We're going to click on IDP Carbide AWSsolutions.com for our SSO configuration, and we're going to click finish. Wonderful. So we've staged all this stuff. The last thing we need to do in this is we need to go to our actual access policy, and we need to include this in our advanced resource assign. All right. So we're going to include that in our advanced resource assign. All right. Update, save. And we're going to apply our access policy. All right, so we've come to the grand finale. Does it work, right? So again, this is another reason why I for enterprise environments, strongly recommend F5. This isn't the way you can set up this flow. You can actually have the initiating kind of flow for the user experience to be a tile within like a central portal or web top, which is a resource within F5 APM. For this, what we're doing is we're simply going to go directly to the Splunk server. It's going to then redirect us. It's going to be very quick, and for the untrained eye, you're not going to even notice it. It's going to redirect you because you don't have a SAML assertion. It's going to do a 3-2 redirect back to the big IP. Big IP then will authenticate you and then build out that SAML assertion, then take back to the Splunk server, which, assuming that the SAML assertion is trusted, it's from a trusted issuing IDP, i.e. the F5, which it should be, and you have the proper attributes and you are mapped correctly from a role perspective, you would then be provided access. So I should be able to get in and have access as an administrator. And yeah, after that, we're going to show how we can just set up a simple web top link and you can kind of make the experience maybe a little bit more fluid. So let's type in our URL. So splunkcarbide.aws. As you can see, I've gone to this a couple different times and we're going to go to it. All right. So you can see it happened extremely quick. It doesn't even register in the actual URL bar at the top. This is my client certificate key. So you can see now that our URL, we've been redirected to our F5 logon page. So it's taken my certificate, it's extracted my email off of it. That's like my first kind of like factor of authentication. Now I'm going to use my username and password as another method for two-factor. And again, you don't have to do this. It's just how my flow is set up. You can do whatever your authentication method is on the front of your policy, right? So you can use RSA Secure ID, you can do YubiKey, you can do client certificate, you can do one-time password, whatever, right? The flexibility is there with APM. This is just how I'm setting up. Let's focus on the SAML portion of this, right? So I'm going to log on, assuming that my password is correct, and then I should be redirected in back, and now I'm in. Right there, as simple as that. And one of the things with SAML, it's kind of I would say a lackluster demo when it finally does work, because again, it's like, wow, like what happened there? Well, a lot of stuff actually did happen there. Just to kind of recap, we went to Splunk. Splunk said, give me a SAML assertion. We don't have a SAML assertion. It says my identity provider is this big IP over here. Go there, and then come back with a SAML assertion. We got redirected. This is all client-based. We got redirected via our browser over to the big IP. We authenticated. It verified us. It then built out a SAML assertion that's aligned to our Splunk service provider. We got redirected back to the Splunk service provider with the SAML assertion, provided it. It then said, yep, this checks out, this checks out. Yes, I trust that. Oh, and I'm going to now map your role to an admin because I see this value in the SAML token. As you can see, for those who are familiar with Splunk, you can see that I have the full access to all of Splunk in here because I am a administrator from a role perspective. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you is, if you just want to kind of like clean up the user experience a little bit, you can actually create a web top link. And I think I already created one, so I'm not going to go through that. I'll show you where you can go and do that. Web top links. So all I do, I just have a web top link in here. So you can make the user experience a little bit cleaner if you want to have a central portal where you have your apps, and you can do this for all of them, all of your applications. And if you want to take it even a step further, and this is for another video, another time, because I think I've used up an ample amount of your time because we're almost at a half an hour, you could actually set your Splunk server, your Splunk search head or search heads behind the big IP, shit on a virtual server on the big IP, and actually do a multi-domain SSO configuration. And the way that flow would work is you would be able to control the actual network access to the Splunk server and more or less make it so that a user has to authenticate first before they're even able to touch the Splunk server, right? And then upon actually authenticating to the central portal, you would then be redirected and Splunk would redirect you again. And because F5 or APM is extremely good when it comes to single sign-on, essentially, as soon as they click on the Splunk resource, there'd be a couple of different redirects that would happen, some exchange of SAML assertions, they'd be able to go in. It's just another level of security, especially when you talk in the realm of zero trust and being able to track user sessions and when they were initiated and executed. That is super important, right? Again, this focuses on just the SAML aspect, but the extensibility and the flexibility of being able to kind of incorporate APM to this is pretty cool. All right, so let's actually put this, enough shameless plugging there. Let's jump in and add this as a resource, and we'll close the demo out with accessing Splunk with this. All right, so we're going to go actually directly to our web top. All right, and you're going to see it's going to be a little bit different of a flow this time. There we go. They have a little icon right there. So same location. It's just now, we could have tiles and have a customized web top experience based off of who the user is and what role they play in the organization. So now we can click on that and the same flow, redirect, boom. It doesn't even look like it's happening. So if you are technical, you would actually be able to do a debug or use kind of in-browser debugging or something like Fiddler, and you would see the redirect. But as a user, from a user experience, it just seems like they clicked on it and they got in there. So, which is pretty remarkable. They've already taken care of all their authentication on the front end, and F5 is able to continue a session and leverage SAML and stuff like that to get in there. So, well, that's it for my demonstration. I hope you enjoyed it. Please, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I appreciate the time, and yeah, look forward to doing these a couple more. Everyone have a great day.